Rachel Kyte. Rachel is Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. Before joining Fletcher, Rachel served as Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. She previously was World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the run-up to the Paris Agreement. She is also a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory group on climate action and an advisor to the UK presidency of the UN climate talks. Welcome, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. And I thought I'd spare you all another PowerPoint. So I just want to talk, I hope that my comments come in nicely on the back of the previous speakers, and just talk a little bit about how I see the year ahead in terms of building into the rules of voluntary carbon markets integrity. Obviously, there's been over the last 24 months in particular, I think, a fairly robust discussion around whether, scale begets integrity or whether clarity around integrity will beget scale. Unsurprisingly, as the co-chair of VCMI, I tend to the latter, but I think that there's been growing pressure from all sides of the market and from all participants for the kind of clarity that is necessary for the market to really grow at pace. So just to back up a little bit so you understand where I'm coming from, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative was sort of kicked off around about almost 2 years ago now. And at the time when the Task Force on Voluntary Carbon Markets was making a splash with its sense of scale and ambition for the voluntary carbon markets, there was important language and important work being done on the fact that we would need to describe what integrity meant on the demand side as well as on the supply side. And so starting in June of 2021, in advance of the Glasgow climate talks, we started to build out with initial funding from the UK government, a multi-stakeholder initiative to look at what integrity would mean on the buy side. So what would be the expectation of corporates in particular as they enter into the voluntary carbon markets? This was seen very much as working in tandem with what became the Integrity Council of Voluntary Carbon Markets and their very important work on carbon credit principles. So I think the original idea was that as we put guardrails around integrity on both the demand side and then on the supply side, that hopefully there would be a handshake in the middle. Of course, there are many more actors and many more acronyms involved in all of this, as many of the speakers before me have indicated. And I think very importantly is the work of SBTI, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And so we, I think through both Glasgow and then in the aftermath of Glasgow and through the whole of last year, there was a lot of work around how to balance ambition and accessibility in the voluntary carbon markets as we build out guardrails for integrity. How do we balance the desire to grow the market so that it's effective? And we look at effective markets, and you need clarity on rules. You need standardized approaches to what happens if you break the rules or if you stay within the rules. You need to see pricing differentiate and value things appropriately, and you need to see transparency. So by June of last year, we were able to issue forth our first edition or a first attempt at a code of conduct for corporates when entering to the voluntary carbon market. And in trying to balance accessibility and ambition, we started with enterprise level claims, so claims that could be made by the enterprise. So we did not get down into the weeds or the details of specific products or a specific service that could make where the corporate would like to make a claim of carbon neutrality or a net zero advertising claim. And in order to balance ambition with accessibility, We also tried to provide on-ramps for companies working where perhaps in the jurisdictions in which they're based, concepts around how net zero at the company level are less clear, where the drivers for that net zero might be less powerful. You might find yourself in a jurisdiction or at the receiving end of a global value chain, or in a jurisdiction where there's been much less public and commercial debate around the use of voluntary carbon markets. So we also wanting to write sort of a global code of conduct, wanted to allow that on-ramp to be there for companies operating in jurisdictions in emerging markets. And so in June of last year, we came out with our first code of conduct, and we tried to set a gold a standard, a silver and a bronze, to be able to say that you achieve VCMI gold, then a company must be on track to achieve its net interim target for scopes 1, 2, and 3 through emissions reductions within its value chain, and covered 100% of remaining unabated emissions through the purchase and retirement of high quality carbon credits. We tried to also address the issue that companies are making claims now around their net zero performance, which will be realized at a date in the future. The interim targets are absolutely essential in order to achieve that. But making a claim now when it won't be realized for some time is one of the issues, which of course provokes a backlash or a reaction to some of those claims. And so both VCMI silver and VCMI gold exist as sort of indicators that you are on a journey, but that you are not yet in a position where you could make a scientifically backed claim to be on track for net zero. So after we published this in June, we put it out for another round of consultation. There'd been significant consultation before we got to June. And we asked a number of companies from different sectors of the economy, from different jurisdictions, to beta test these guidelines. And we published then in the fall of last year the feedback that we'd received from everybody who tested this, tried to use it, and everybody who'd considered it. And I think it's fair to say that the feedback was broadly that we were more or less in the right place, that we had balanced ambition with accessibility, but that there were some questions where we needed to provide greater clarity. I think there is specifically a need for, I think there were 5 areas of clarity, including, how do you treat removal credits, reduction credits, other credits? I mean, how does that sort of get teased out at this stage of the market's development? How do we treat corresponding adjustments, or do we adequately treat corresponding adjustments? And whether or not we were too ambitious or not enough, whether the on-ramps were efficient and effective and helpful enough, or was the whole thing just too difficult? We've taken all of that feedback, and we are now in the process of further consultation. And our goal is to provide in June of this year a second edition of the Code of Conduct. There are other things that need to happen on the demand side, other pieces of research, other pieces of work, more detailed work. They are also ongoing at the same time. But we will bring forward a new version, a 2.0 version of the Code of Conduct, together with guidance on how to use it in June, mindful of the increasing pressure that there should be more clarity on the demand side, as well as more clarity on the supply side. So what does this mean? Well, it means that by the time we get to the Secretary General's Climate Summit on the occasion of the General Assembly, or Climate Week as it's known in the corporate world, I would hope that you could put the new Code of Conduct alongside the work of ICVCM and their carbon credit principles, alongside perhaps more guidance and clarity as is being worked on by SBTI, and you could begin to show how these things fit together and how these emerging scaffolding of a high integrity sort of demand to supply, soup to nuts voluntary carbon market it could begin to work. This would allow then many other initiatives which are looking at bolstering the voluntary carbon markets globally, but also looking at applying voluntary carbon markets to political priorities, including retiring industrial credits, that these announcements, which are working politically, that if those entities involved with that would be able to then take this emerging clarity or emerging framework and use that in their announcements that they may or may not make at COP28. So we're finally, we're very sensitive to the buildup of pressure on the demand side from participants who want to know that if they adhere to VCMI goal, that would mean something, that they would be able, in addition to the pressure that they feel, to be able to access high quality, high integrity carbon credits, and that those carbon credits would be something that would be of value over the medium to long term. So I think we're very sensitive to all that. We're also sensitive to the pressure that's coming from the UN following a year's worth of work between COP26 in Glasgow and COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where Catherine McKenna, the former Minister of Environment of Canada, pulled together a commission on behalf of the Secretary General to look at the claims that non-state actors make and how to understand how to make a net zero claim when you are a voluntary actor. So, of course, we have to remember that we are building these voluntary carbon markets. We are trying to put guardrails around the integrity of these markets, and we're trying to understand the integrity of a claim of net zero in an entirely voluntary world. And so the question of how do you hold somebody accountable for a voluntary commitment as a voluntary actor, because they're not states, they're not countries, is something that the UN is wrestling with. But I think in the case of VCMI, we are, our goal is to make sure that our code of conduct can be understood as a code of conduct that would lead you to be in a position of integrity with the standards that the UN is articulating for when somebody could make a net zero claim. So the final piece of this is that there are other elements of a market that will need to be developed. Again, operating in an entirely voluntary carbon market, but needing to make sure that these voluntary carbon markets do actually help with the speeding up of reductions of emissions and removals of emissions, and also that they do provide a revenue stream to countries and regions and rights holders and others that can aspire to at that revenue stream. Then I think we have other questions to answer in the next year or so. Where do you go if you feel that a claim is not legitimate? Where do you go if you feel that a company is meeting a VCMI standard, but is still far from being on a legitimate track to net zero? So these are questions of accountability. These are questions for how auditing standards organizations instruct auditors to understand how they hold companies to account, so that we can, I think we will see an emerging landscape of the sort of additional architecture that's necessary for any market to operate, and certainly in this case for a global voluntary carbon market to operate with integrity, which will give confidence to those who wish to buy and to participate, and would give confidence to those who desperately need to see revenue streams flow to their activities. The final thing I would say is that just in talking to a lot of market participants in the last few weeks, as we've been trying to speed up our work at VCMI, I'm keenly aware that the lack of clarity or the perceived lack of clarity or the perceived risk of some kind of reversal or a change in treatment or a change in mood, is for many actors who are working in good faith and with integrity as their mindset or as their framework, operational framework, that there is evidence, especially perhaps in the US, that companies are sort of holding back from participating in the voluntary carbon markets until more clarity is there. And that, of course, these are the companies that you would want to have participate in the market in order to build its confidence and its reputation. So keenly aware of how the dividing lines are falling within the community, but also trying not to shy away from the difficult stuff and to try to offer a framework which would help everybody understand that a corporation can use the voluntary carbon market in such a way as to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Rachel, we have a few questions for you.
I'm sure.
Hi, David Oliver from DevStream here. Thank you for the presentation. I just had a question about the if the work you're doing or the group is doing with the VCMI includes or is planning to include some sort of a benchmarking on the carbon pricing that companies could use offsets for, meaning that anything below a certain price point should be dealt with internally at the corporate level emissions and address those emissions internally versus like buying offsets externally.
Yeah, we haven't got into sort of specific pricing or pricing bands. We've been quite clear about the things that you need to do, the things that you would need to take care of in terms of reducing your own emissions, and before you could then use credits. But we are sensitive to the fact that this to meet the VCMI gold standard is a significant expenditure, and I think that there is some. I think when issuing a code of conduct, then we should. That's one piece of work. I think there is other work that should happen, is happening. Many people are looking at where prices should emerge, could emerge. I think there's also a question of, and I think there's divergent opinion upon this as well, which is, how would you price removal credits versus reduction credits, etc. I think the market is not quite mature enough for all of these bands to emerge. Now, how that is iterated in the future, I think we would be part of that conversation, but I don't think we see that as our role at the moment. So at the moment, we're trying to clarify or update and reflect all of the feedback we got in a second version of the code of conduct. And we're commissioning other pieces of research, and this is something that we're looking at, but at the moment, I expect others to be coming forward with some work in this area.
Thank you, Rachel. Another question for you.
Hi, Rachel. Lizzie of Anu. I have a question related to the way the net zero gold guidance allowed both avoidance and removals to qualify. And you had kind of mentioned there is syncing with SBTI, but currently SBTI's net zero standard only allows removals for a small portion of the outside of the fence line reductions, or I should say removals. So how is that coordinated, since VCMI is allowing both avoidance and removals? SBTI has been very clear they're only allowing removals for their net zero standard. And will that lead to confusion as corporates make the VCMI net zero gold claim?
Yeah, so this is a point that we wrestled with, and it's come through in the feedback as well, and we get questions about it. So we're in contact with SBTI. I mean, there's no sort of a priori agreement with them. I mean, they're independent. We're independent. How we work together, continue to work very closely together, I think is important. And I think that the thing to remember about VCMI Gold is that this is your next interim target, right? So I think that where we come out in this June, I'm not sure at the moment, but where we came out last June was that, in advance of your next interim target, then we felt we could justify a VCMI goal that allowed avoidance credits in there. By the time you get to your next interim target, then that would be less and less advisable, desirable, or potentially under VCMI even allowable. So I think this is very much one of the key issues that we need to resolve. It's something that the UN panel raised with us as well. And so I think there'll be more clarity on that in June. I would say that in the feedback that we got from corporates in our first iteration, a sizable percentage of them felt that it was too strict. Now VCMI gold is difficult to achieve, and so I think getting that balance right is going to be something that we continue to spend a lot of time on. The final thing I would say is that as SBTI looks at guidance for sectors, the coordination between SBTI and ourselves will also be very important. We heard a lot of feedback that in this sector or in this sector or in this industry, there needed to be specific guidance and specific on-ramps or specific trajectories. And again, we felt that we had to write a sort of global and comprehensive standard. So it's a good question, a partial procedural answer, not a substantive answer at this point.
Stephen Adler, Chairman of Charity Brands. Thank you for your brilliance. Just two quick thoughts. We've worked for the UN Foundation as agency. We also worked for American Heart. We've introduced the Heart Check 15 years ago, which is on 60 billion products. So two thoughts, and perhaps we'll talk about them later. One is with the SDGs, got a bit of momentum with people just using that as a reach goal, starting to use the SDGs information and intellectual property. In the Heart Check, to see gold, attending this amazing conference, any simplicity to corporations who will fund this would be amazing. But thanks for your brilliant work. Just a couple of suggestions there.
Well, yeah, maybe just an additional observation. So obviously clarity is key, consistency is key. Both to the corporation that has the difficult job of working out how to use VCMIs within a science-based pathway, but also then to investors and the consumer, and one would hope, emerging frameworks of legislation and regulation. What we've seen is interchangeability of the phrases net zero and carbon neutrality and various other labels as well. You can go into a supermarket and buy a carbon neutral this, that, or the other. You can even buy a carbon neutral, liter of fuel in some parts of the world. And so, the first defense against that, if it's not legitimate, right, is going to be advertising standards authorities and consumer protection bureaus, but they don't exist in most parts of the world in a robust enough way. But what I also think is we've talked to a lot of companies that have a product which they would like to sell as carbon neutral in an enterprise that is not. Lots of companies have talked to us about, well, okay, we're a conglomerate and this piece of our business and this piece of our business are on pathways to net zero under one trajectory. These pieces of our business aren't. How do we operate with this? And those are C-suite and board level conversations. And then I think we've also spoken to companies that are like, okay, well, I'm on a pathway to net zero, but we're about to merge or acquire another entity that's going to set us back. Again, how do we interpret? So I think there is a frustration that this is taking a lot of time, but I think that these kinds of conversations with legitimate, and important firms around the world of all kinds of sizes and shapes in all kinds of industry and across the financial markets we need more of it rather than less. And so we'll try to hold on to the branch of clarity at least.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thanks, everybody. Great question.